"Sir, your meal is poisoned. Don't eat out of it." The words came from somewhere beside the head of the table, small and clear and utterly calm. And for a moment the entire dining room simply stopped breathing. Every servant froze where they stood. Every bodyguard along the walls went rigid. At the far end of the table, a woman's hand locked around the stem of her wine glass so tightly her knuckles drained of color. A little girl stood beside Kim Woo-jin's chair. She was 6 years old, maybe, with dark, serious eyes and 2 lopsided pigtails, and a yellow dress with a grass stain on the hem. She looked up at the most feared man in Korea, with the calm, unwavering gravity of someone who had something important to say, and was going to say it regardless of who was listening. Woo-jin himself had not moved. Yet he set his chopsticks down with a quiet, precise click and turned to look at her. "How do you know that, little girl?" His voice was calm. It was always calm, not the calm of peace, but the calm of precision, of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to make a room afraid. The little girl, Dora, though he didn't know her name yet, did not wilt under it. She tilted her head slightly, as though measuring how much detail he could handle, and then she told him. She had been in the greenhouse that afternoon, sitting in her favorite hidden spot behind the tall ferns where she liked to draw. She hadn't meant to spy, but 2 people had come in speaking in low, hurried voices, and she had recognized one of them. She pointed. A small, decisive finger aimed across the table. "Her," Dora said. "She was with a man. They were talking about putting something in your food tonight. The man had a scar here." She drew a line just below her left eye with her fingertip. "He had a long, dark coat, and he kept looking at the door like he was scared someone would come in." Something shifted in Woo-jin's expression, barely visible, a slight tightening around the eyes. Not shock. Recognition. He said nothing. He simply turned to look at Mina. Mina flew out of her chair. "She's lying!" Her voice came out loud and shrill, her composure gone in an instant. She pointed at Dora with a shaking finger. "She is a servant's child who snuck into your dining room, and she is lying through her teeth. You take it back right now," she snapped at Dora, "or I will make sure you and your mother are on the street by morning. Do you hear me? Take it back." Dora looked at her. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She stood with her small hands clasped in front of her and held Mina's furious gaze with a steadiness that seemed, somehow, to make Mina even angrier. Woo-jin watched the child for one quiet moment. Then he looked at Mina, and when he spoke, his voice was almost gentle. "Eat it," he said. The room went still again. "I beg your pardon?" Mina whispered. "The food." He gestured to his plate with one unhurried hand. "If the child is lying, it's just food. Eat it, and we will know she was wrong." A fractional tilt of his head. "Unless you have a reason not to." The color drained from Mina's face. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her throat moved. In the silence of that room, Mina's guilt became the loudest thing in it. He lost her for 6 years, found her through his daughter, and almost lost everything in one night. When young Dora saves the life of Kim Woo-jin, South Korea's most ruthless mafia boss, one unexpected turn reunites him with a love he thought was gone forever, and a family he never knew he needed. One night, a lifetime of love, danger, and destiny, a fearless child, a ruthless boss, a love that refused to stay lost. Welcome to Afro-Korean romance cinema, where love walks the edge of danger and endings are never predictable. If you're new here, hit subscribe and join the tribe. But real quick, what time is it where you are and where are you watching from? Drop it below. I love seeing how far this story travels. And be honest, are you already hooked? If yes, smash that like button and turn on notifications. Yet you do not want to miss what's coming. Now, let's rewind to where this heartwarming story truly began. The night Woo-jin first laid eyes on the enchanting Stella at a Chicago gala. 6 years ago. Kim Woo-jin had not wanted to go to the gala. He had attended it only because refusing it would have cost him a business relationship that was not yet worth losing, And Woo Jin never made decisions based on what he wanted, only on what was strategically sound. He had stood at the edge of the grand ballroom in his perfectly tailored suit, champagne glass in hand, watching the room with the detached precision of a man doing calculations in his head rather than enjoying himself, because that was exactly what he was doing. And then he had seen her. She was not the most extravagantly dressed woman in the room. She was not trying to be noticed. She was standing near the tall windows that overlooked the city lights, wearing a deep blue dress that she seemed slightly unsure of, laughing at something the woman beside her had said, with the kind of wholehearted, unself-conscious laugh that people who are used to performing for rooms never produce. It was real. Every bit of it was real. He had crossed the room before he had thought about crossing it. Her name was Stella. She was warm in a way that he had no framework for, not soft or naive, but genuinely, substantively warm. She had a business degree and opinions she wasn't afraid to hold, and she argued one of his points so cleanly and confidently, right there at that gala with champagne in her hand, that he had felt something unfamiliar shift in his chest. He was, against every carefully built instinct he owned, completely disarmed. They had talked for 3 hours. They had gone for a walk along the river after the gala ended because neither of them wanted the conversation to stop. And then, at the end of one long, golden, impossible night, the kind of night that seems to exist outside of ordinary life, in its own separate pocket of time, they had ended up in the penthouse suite of his hotel. He had fallen asleep beside her in the blue hours before dawn, feeling, for the first time in his adult life, something that might have been contentment. When he woke up, she was gone. He had not even known her last name. He had searched for her. That part of the story is important. And it was not a passing thought, not a casual inquiry made once and then abandoned. Woo Jin had directed real resources toward finding her, had pulled on every thread available to him for 6 years, and had hit nothing but dead ends. Stella, it turned out, had an exceptionally ordinary digital footprint for a woman who was, in every other sense, extraordinary. He had never stopped looking. He had simply, eventually, run out of places to look. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that 1 month after that night in Chicago, Stella had sat alone in her apartment bathroom, staring at 2 pink lines and changing the entire course of her life. She had been careful. They had both been careful. And yet, the decision had not actually been difficult. Stella was the kind of woman who, when life handed her something unexpected, found a way to fold it into her heart and make space for it. She had sat with the shock for about 3 days, and then she had started making lists. She was good at lists. She was good at plans. She named her daughter Dora. And Dora, from the very first moment she arrived in the world with her father's dark, intense eyes and her mother's unstoppable warmth, was entirely, effortlessly herself. She was the kind of child who made friends with every person she met within approximately 4 minutes. She was the kind of child who noticed things, really noticed them, the way most adults forget to. She asked questions that were either very wise or very funny, and somehow often both at once. She drew pictures constantly, carrying a small notebook and a handful of colored pencils wherever she went. She was fearless, not because she was unaware of fear, but because her curiosity about the world was always just slightly stronger than her caution. Stella raised her with everything she had. For 5 years it was just the 2 of them, and those 5 years were hard and sometimes lonely and absolutely full of love. But as Dora grew, and as her father's dark eyes looked back at Stella from her daughter's small face every single day, the question that had started as a quiet whisper became impossible to ignore. Dora deserved to know where she came from. She deserved the chance to know her father. And so when Dora turned 6, Stella made the most terrifying decision of her life. She packed up their apartment. She researched Seoul. She converted her savings into Korean won, taught herself a handful of phrases from a language app, signed Dora up for a preschool that offered translation support, and bought 2 one-way tickets. She had almost nothing to go on. A first name, a face she saw every time she looked at her daughter, the memory of a night in Chicago, and the particular way he had laughed, rarely, and quietly, like he didn't quite trust himself to. She landed in Seoul in autumn, holding Dora's hand in one of hers and a rolling suitcase in the other, her heart hammering and her chin lifted. 3 months before, the Kim estate was, by any measure, extraordinary. Stella had learned this not from the outside, though the gates alone were enough to understand that the person inside operated at a level of wealth that belonged to a different world, but from the inside, because that was where she worked. The job had come through a contact of a contact, or a staffing connection that her friend Ji Yeon had managed to arrange. It was not the kind of job Stella had imagined herself doing with a business degree. But her savings were thinning, her Korean was still halting, and the job market for foreign-qualified business graduates in Seoul was considerably less forgiving than she had hoped. She was a cleaner at a chaebol's estate. She took the job, and she did it with the same quiet, complete dedication that she brought to everything. She was efficient and thorough and unobtrusive, and within the first few weeks the other staff had simply accepted her as one of their own. And Dora, whom Stella brought with her every day while the preschool handled its paperwork, had, rather inevitably, become beloved by the entire household. And she helped the gardener water the orchids and came home with her favorite yellow flowers tucked behind her ear. She sat at the kitchen counter and watched the chef with enormous, captivated eyes until he eventually gave in and started teaching her to fold dumplings. She told the head bodyguard gravely that he had a kind face for someone whose job was to look scary, and he had needed to turn away quickly to compose himself. She knew everyone's name. She asked after everyone's families. She drew portraits of the staff in her little notebook and presented them with great ceremony. The one person she had never seen was the owner of the estate himself. She knew he existed. Everyone spoke of him with a certain careful reverence, not resentful exactly, but measured. He was fair, one of the senior maids had explained to Stella quietly, dainty but demanding. He expected perfection and he rewarded it. But he was not a man whose company was sought lightly. He kept his own world, and the staff kept theirs, and the two existed in the same estate without collision. Until the afternoon that Dora went to draw in the greenhouse. Fast forward back to the present. Mina's knees hit the marble floor of the dining room with a crack. It happened so suddenly, the collapse from furious denial into desperate, crumbling supplication, that several of the servants flinched. Mina's hands were pressed flat on the floor, her head bowed, her voice breaking into something ragged and unrecognizable. "Please," she said. "Woo-jin, please, I'm sorry, it wasn't, please don't." Woo-jin looked at her. His expression had not changed in the slightest, or not one muscle in his face moved with anything resembling mercy or satisfaction or anger. He was simply watching her the way a person watches something they have already decided about, waiting for the formality of it to conclude. Everyone in Korea knew what Kim Woo-jin did to those who crossed him. Not through violence, he had no interest in anything so crude. He destroyed them with precision, strategically, completely. He left nothing standing that could be rebuilt, and he did it without ever raising his voice. Mina knew this better than anyone. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and even and absolutely final. "I told you when we became engaged that loyalty was the only thing I required from you," he said. "Not affection, not performance, loyalty." He let a short silence sit. "Your father and you were planning this from the beginning, weren't you? The engagement was never anything other than a means to access." Mina made a broken sound that was neither confirmation nor denial. "And Min-jae." He said his former best friend's name with a flatness that was worse than any rage could have been. "How long?" Mina did not answer. Woo-jin nodded once, slowly, as though something had been confirmed inside him that he had suspected for some time. "I won't touch you physically," he said. "I never do. But I promise you this, by the time I am finished, you will wish I had." He turned to his head of security. "Remove her from the property." And then, as if Mina had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way, he turned his full attention to the small girl who was still standing beside his chair. She was watching him with dark, steady eyes that reminded him, for a reason he could not name, of someone. Her small arms were folded loosely in front of her head tilted slightly to one side, a posture of someone who is thinking carefully before speaking. He found himself unexpectedly wanting to know what she was thinking. "Your name," he said. "Dora," she said, and then she added with a slight narrowing of her eyes, "You didn't tell me yours. That's rude, you know. My mother says you should always introduce yourself." Something happened then that had not happened to Kim Woo-jin in a very long time. He almost smiled. It started at the corner of his mouth, just the faintest reluctant curve, and for a moment, in the warm light of the dining room, and it was possible to see what he might have looked like if the last decade had been kinder to him. "My name is Woo-jin," he said. "Kim Woo-jin." Dora appeared to consider this. "That's a good name," she said, with the air of someone rendering a genuine verdict. "You're welcome, by the way. For the food thing." "You saved my life," he said. "Yes," Dora agreed, without false modesty. "I did." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not afraid of me." She scrunched her nose slightly. "Should I be?" "Most adults are." "I'm not an adult," she pointed out, with the impeccable logic of a 6-year-old. "And you seem okay. You didn't yell or anything, even when that lady was saying mean things about me. I liked that." Woo-jin studied her. "I owe you something," he said. "For what you did. What would you like?" Dora's face went thoughtful, in a way that was startlingly serious for a child. Brow furrowed, lips pressed together, the posture of someone who was genuinely taking a decision seriously. "Okay," she said at last. "My mommy works here. She cleans. And every night when she comes home, her feet hurt and her shoulders hurt, and she looks tired, but she still makes me dinner and reads me stories, and she never complains even once." She looked up at him. "Can you make sure she doesn't have so much work to do, but still pay her the same? She worries about money a lot even when she thinks I'm asleep." The dining room was very quiet. One of the senior maids pressed her lips together tightly. The head bodyguard looked at the wall. Woo-jin was still, but something in his stillness had changed. It had a different quality now, softer at its center. He looked at this small girl who had used her one wish on her mother, and he felt something move in him, quiet and deep, like a stone shifting at the bottom of a river. "Done," he said. "And now I would like to meet your mother. I'll have someone bring her to my office." He extended his hand to Dora, a gesture so unexpectedly gentle from a man of his reputation that it briefly transfixed everyone in the room. "Will you come with me?" Dora looked at his hand, then back at his face. Then she placed her small hand in his large one, with the easy, uncalculating trust of a child who has never been given a reason not to trust. "Okay," she said. "But can we talk about something on the way? I've been wondering about the big board game in the sitting room. Oh, the one with all the different pieces that look like horses and castles." "Chess," he said as they walked. "Yes, that one. Can you explain it to me?" "I can." "I thought you might know," Dora said, with a satisfied little nod. "You seem like someone who knows chess." The office. Stella ran. She had heard what happened in the dining room through the accelerating whisper chain that moved through the estate's staff faster than any formal announcement, and by the time she reached the corridor outside the office, she was breathless, her heart beating in her throat, her mind cycling rapidly through every possible outcome for a situation in which her 6-year-old daughter had accused the master of the house of being poisoned and then been personally escorted to his private office. She smoothed her uniform, she breathed in, she knocked. "Enter." She pushed open the door. The office was warm and low-lit, book-lined and imposing, and on the long leather couch nearest the window sat Dora, bright-eyed, entirely unharmed, currently pointing at a chess piece and saying, "But why is the horse allowed to jump over everyone? That seems like cheating." And beside her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in a posture that was so unlike the rigid formality she had expected that it stopped her in the doorway, sat a man. A man who was listening to her daughter with complete, unhurried attention. A man whose profile she recognized before any other part of her brain caught up. The jaw, the particular angle of his nose, the line of his shoulders, the way he held himself. The world tilted. Stella's hand found the doorframe. Dora looked up at the sound and launched herself off the couch with a happy cry. "Mommy!" She reached Stella and grabbed both her hands, tugging. "Mommy, you have to come meet Woo Jin. He promised to give me a wish because I saved his life, and I wished for your work to be easier, and he said yes, and now he's teaching me about chess, and the horsey piece can jump over everyone. Isn't that amazing?" Stella looked down at her daughter. She was aware, distantly, that she was supposed to be forming words. She was aware that Dora was still talking, her small hands waving expressively as she described the intricacies of the chessboard. She could feel all of this happening at the normal pace of time, but the man had risen from the couch, and now he was looking at her, and the world had simply stopped. Woo Jin stood very still. He had the look of a man who had just seen something that fundamentally rewrote the logic of the last 6 years, a man watching a variable he had long since accounted as irretrievably lost walk through his office door. He said nothing. He was incapable, in that moment, of saying anything at all. Dora was still talking. "And he says the castle piece is called a rook, which doesn't make sense because it looks nothing like a bird, Mommy. Are you listening? Mommy?" Stella dropped to one knee in front of Dora and cupped her small face in both hands. "You're okay," she breathed. "You're absolutely okay?" "I'm great," Dora said with mild exasperation. "I told you I saved his life. I was very brave." "You were," Stella said. Her voice was barely audible. "You were incredibly brave, baby." She straightened. She had to look at him. She had no choice but to look at him. Woo Jin's voice, when it came, was quieter than she expected. The commanding edge was still there. It was bone deep in him. She could hear it. But underneath it, there was something else. Something unsteady. "What are you doing in Korea?" he said. It was barely a question. It was closer to a man thinking out loud. Stella opened her mouth. Before she could answer, Dora tugged at Woo Jin's sleeve with the casual familiarity of a child who had decided within the last hour that he was perfectly safe. "We're here to find my daddy," she announced brightly. "So we can all be one big happy family. That's why Mommy moved us all the way here from Chicago. She said we had to give it a try. Can you believe we came all the way to Korea to find him? I think it's very romantic, actually." Gone, she said the word romantic with great relish, clearly having recently acquired it. "My mommy is very romantic. She just doesn't know it yet." The room was very quiet. Woo Jin turned to Stella slowly. Stella could not breathe. She watched him doing the mathematics she had been doing for 6 years, in a matter of silent seconds. Dora's age, Chicago, the night that had refused to leave his memory, no matter how hard his life had pressed down on top of it. "How old?" he began. The question fell apart before he could finish it. He already knew. Stella nodded. It was all she could do. A single, careful nod, and something in her expression broke open in a way she hadn't planned, a way she hadn't had time to protect against. She had thought about this moment 1,000 times. She had rehearsed it in quiet apartment kitchens, on park benches while Dora played, in the narrow seat of the plane on the long flight over. She had prepared speeches. She had arranged arguments. She had been thoughtful and organized and thorough. None of it had accounted for this. For him standing 6 feet away, looking at her like she was something he had almost stopped believing existed. "I should take her home," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "It's late, and she has school tomorrow. I need a little time before I can talk properly. There's a lot to say." Woo Jin looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded once. "I'll drive you," he said. After Stella and Dora had bid him good night, Woo Jin still stood outside their apartment building for a while. He wasn't sure how long. And it was a rundown building in a neighborhood that spoke plainly of limited resources, the kind of place where the heating was unpredictable and the elevator didn't always work. He thought about Stella, whom he remembered as a woman of precision and ambition and great personal capability, choosing this building. Crossing an ocean to this building, with a 6-year-old in a suitcase and a name she had held on to for 6 years. He hadn't slept that night. He was at their door before 8 in the morning. Stella answered in a sweater and bare feet, hair loose, coffee cup in hand, and she looked at him for a long moment without surprise. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. They walked to a small cafe around the corner after dropping Dora at preschool. It was warm inside and quiet. And they sat across a small wooden table from each other with their coffee cups between them, and 6 years of silence waiting to be broken. It was Woo Jin who spoke first. "I looked for you," he said, "for a long time." Stella's hands tightened slightly around her cup. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought," she shook her head, "I thought we were two strangers who'd had one extraordinary night. I thought if I'd stayed until morning it would just become something strange and complicated, and I was embarrassed, honestly. I left before I could embarrass myself further." "You were embarrassed," he repeated. "I'd never done anything like that before." She looked at him. "I haven't since." Something softened in his face. Not dramatically. Woo Jin was not a dramatic person, but it was there. "I woke up and you were gone. And I didn't even have a last name." "I didn't have anything either," Stella said quietly. "I had a first name and a face I couldn't stop thinking about. And 6 weeks later I found out I was going to have your baby." She paused. "I know I should have tried harder to find you. I know that. But I didn't know your last name, and I didn't want to be a woman who tracked down a one-night stand with a pregnancy claim. I wanted to do it on my own." "And you did," he said. There was something in his voice that was not quite admiration and was not quite grief, but lived between the two. "You did it completely on your own." "She's wonderful," Stella said, and her voice went warm the way it always did when she talked about Dora. "She's funny and fearless, and she cares about everyone she meets. Oh, she drew portraits of your entire kitchen staff within 2 weeks of being in that house." A small laugh escaped her. "She gave your head bodyguard one and told him he had a warrior's soul. He nearly cried." Woo Jin looked down at his coffee. "She told me I was rude for not introducing myself." Stella winced. "She does that." She was right. She usually is. She looked across the table at him. "I came to Korea to find you. I want you to know that. I wasn't coming to make demands or complicate your life. Dora deserves to know you, and you deserve to know her. Whatever that looks like for you, I'm not asking for anything beyond that." Woo Jin raised his eyes to hers, and there was nothing of the careful, measured businessman in his gaze now. It just a man looking at a woman who had walked across the world carrying something that was partly his. "What if I'm asking for more than that?" he said. Stella looked at him. "I need you in my life," he said. It came out quiet and blunt and entirely unembellished, the way Woo Jin said everything he meant. "I have needed you in it for 6 years without knowing your last name. I would like the chance, if you're willing, to do this the right way. All of it." Stella was quiet for a long moment. "You don't know me," she said. "Not really. One night in Chicago." "I know," he said. "I know that one night. I know it better than most of the years that came after it. And I'd like the rest of them, if you'll give them to me." She looked at him for a long time, and then, slowly, and the warm and unstoppable smile that had undone him in a Chicago ballroom 6 years ago broke across her face. "You're going to have to be patient," she warned him. I don't do anything quickly. I make lists. I think things through. I'm going to need time." "I have been looking for you for 6 years," Woo Jin said. "I have time." 6 months later. The engagement announcement came on a quiet evening in late spring, on the terrace of his estate, with the city lights spreading below them. He had not done it dramatically. That was not his way. He had simply produced the ring at the end of a dinner that was just the three of them, him, Stella, Dora, and said that he would very much like for them to be a family, formally and permanently if Stella was agreeable. Dora had made it considerably less quiet by shrieking with delight so loudly that 2 bodyguards came running. During those 6 months, Woo Jin had reorganized his entire schedule around afternoons with Dora. He, who had not reorganized his schedule for anything other than a financial crisis in 15 years, now kept 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock every single day sacrosanct. He taught her chess. She taught him about her drawings, sitting beside him at his enormous desk and narrating in great detail what each of her pictures meant. He took her to the botanical gardens and held her hand while she examined each flower with the solemnity of a scientist. She fell asleep on his shoulder in the car on the way home, and he did not move for 40 minutes so as not to wake her. After he and Stella had sat Dora down one evening and told her he was her father, the two of them had become practically inseparable. Dora had accepted him wholly. He also had fallen in love with her with a speed and completeness that surprised him. He was not a man accustomed to being surprised. And Stella he fell in love with more slowly, the way a man who has spent his whole life being careful falls in love when he finally lets himself. Conversation by conversation, afternoon by afternoon. He found her in the kitchen of the new apartment he had eventually persuaded her to move into, a far better one, with a view of the Han River, standing on her toes to reach a shelf, laughing at herself. He found her at her laptop at midnight, with reading glasses he hadn't known she owned, frowning at a financial report for the new job she had finally landed. He found her singing something soft and tuneless to Dora at bedtime through the cracked door, and he stood in the corridor and felt the fullness of a life he had not known he was building pressing against his chest like something trying to get out. "You're staring at her again," Dora informed him one evening, coming to stand beside him in the doorway. "I'm not staring," he said. "You are, though," she said companionably, slipping her hand into his. "It's okay. She's very nice to look at. I think she's the most beautiful person in the world, actually." A small pause. "You can think so too, if you want. I don't mind sharing." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Dora," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "Also, when are you going to ask her to marry you? I've been very patient." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, somewhere across Seoul, in a shrinking corner of a world that used to be enormous and glittering and entirely hers, someone else was watching the news of Woo Jin's and Stella's engagement on a cracked phone screen. Mina could not believe her new reality. 6 months ago, she had woken up in a penthouse with a personal stylist on call and a driver waiting downstairs and a social calendar so full she sometimes had to review it over breakfast to remember what city she was supposed to be in. She had been the daughter of one of Korea's most powerful men, the fiancé of another, and the envy of every woman in the circles she moved in. She had been untouchable. That was 6 months ago. Now she sat on a thin mattress in an apartment so small she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms out. Eating convenience store food because it was the only thing she could still afford. Watching her phone charge on the floor because there was no furniture to put it on. The walls were covered. She had started printing the photographs 3 months ago, when the news about Woo Jin and Stella had first started appearing, and she realized she had nowhere to put the rage except outward. Pictures scattered on the walls showing Woo Jin at a business dinner, Woo Jin leaving his estate, Stella walking to her new office in the financial district, head up, that infuriating warm expression on her face like she hadn't taken everything. That child, the one who had started all of this, holding Woo Jin's hand outside the botanical gardens, pointing at something with her free hand, laughing. And Mina looked at that photograph the most. She was not going to pretend, even to herself, that her life had been ruined by a 6-year-old. It had been ruined by Woo Jin. It had been ruined by her own father and Min Jae, and their spectacular failure to execute a plan that should have been simple. But the child had been the one standing beside his chair that night, pointing across the table with her small righteous finger, and every time Mina thought about how her entire world had collapsed in the hours that followed, the image that played first was always Dora's face. Calm, unafraid, unbothered. A 6-year-old had looked at Mina and felt nothing, not awe, not fear, not even the mild discomfort that most adults manage to produce in her presence. Just nothing. As though Mina were simply a problem to be solved and then set aside. Yeah, she hated her for it with a completeness that she was aware was irrational and didn't care. Woojin had done what he promised. He had done it with a speed and thoroughness that she still found difficult to fully comprehend when she tried to catalog the destruction. Her father's company, built over 40 years, a genuine empire, had been dismantled in weeks. Stocks plummeted. Investors fled. Creditors called in every debt simultaneously, and the bank had seized everything before her father had even engaged his lawyers. The arrest had come shortly after, her father and Min Jae both, charged with embezzlement and money laundering, evidence gathered so methodically and so completely that their legal team had gone very quiet at their first meeting and not had much to say since. They were both in prison now, her father in one wing, Min Jae in another, and Min Ah in between them in every sense that mattered, cut off from both, cut off from money, cut off from the friends who had evaporated the moment her name stopped being useful to attach to. She had no intention of accepting this. What Woojin had done was take everything from her with his eyes open, with full knowledge of what he was doing, and call it justice. He had sat across from her downfall and felt nothing. And now he was announcing his engagement to some African-American woman with a mop and a child, and the whole country was applauding him, and Mina was sitting on a mattress watching it happen. She was done watching. She had spent these months cataloging, learning. The preschool Dora attended was a 12-minute drive from the estate, and a bright painted building on a quiet street with a low security profile because it was a preschool, because nobody kidnapped children from preschools, because until very recently it would never have occurred to anyone that a child connected to Kim Woo-jin might be vulnerable there. She had walked past it enough times to know the layout. She had noted the bathroom at the far end of the east corridor that backed onto a side alley, the window that sat low enough to the ground, the gap in the afternoon supervision schedule between 2:30 and 3 o'clock when the teachers were managing the classroom transition and the yard was briefly, reliably, quiet. She had noted that Woojin always came to collect Dora personally at 3, always with bodyguards, always from the front entrance, not from a side alley at 2:30. And she had thought about what she needed from him, not revenge in the pure destructive sense. She was past that particular luxury. She needed money, enough of it, and in the right form, to rebuild something. Company shares, liquid and transferable, worth enough to matter. She had worked out the figure carefully, had run the numbers twice, and arrived at an amount that would let her leave Korea if she needed to, or stay and start over if she didn't. She didn't particularly care which. She just needed to be somewhere that wasn't this mattress. The plan was not complicated. Take the child, send the demand, collect what she was owed. She told herself it was straightforward. She told herself it was just business, the same cold calculation that Woojin himself would respect if the positions were reversed. And she told herself a lot of things in that small apartment, surrounded by photographs of people she despised, and most of them almost sounded true. On the morning she decided to move, she stood in front of her wall of photographs for a long time. She looked at Woojin's face. She looked at Stella's. She looked at Dora's. Then she picked up her bag and left. Later that day, Mina positioned herself on a bench across the street with a paper coffee cup and unremarkable clothes and the particular stillness of someone who has spent weeks practicing how not to be noticed. She had been waiting since 8 o'clock. She had watched Stella drop Dora at the gate, had watched her sentimental, unnecessary pause as Dora was led into the building by a teacher, and felt nothing except impatience for her to leave. When Stella finally walked away, as Mina finished her coffee, she did not move immediately. She waited another 20 minutes, watching the school settle into its morning rhythm. watching the teachers move between classrooms through the windows, counting the patterns she had memorized over weeks of watching from this same bench. At 9:10, she crossed the street. She didn't go through the front gate. She went around the back, to the delivery entrance that sat unlocked between 8 and 10 every morning while the kitchen received its supply orders. She had walked through it twice before, on different days, at different times, dressed differently each time. No one had stopped her. No one had asked. She had a face that looked like it belonged somewhere. It was one of the few things left from her old life that still served her. Inside, as she moved through the staff corridor toward the east wing, she kept her pace even, her expression neutral and purposeful. She passed a cleaner with a mop. She passed a teaching assistant carrying a stack of construction paper. Neither of them looked at her twice. She found Dora in the yard at morning break, crouched in a corner near the flower beds with her notebook open, drawing something with her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. She was alone at the edges of the yard. Her friends were at the climbing frame, shouting at each other about something, and Dora had apparently decided the flowers were more interesting. Of course she had. Mina crouched down a short distance away and kept her voice calm, almost bored, as though she were simply delivering a message. "Dora, your daddy sent me. He's at the front with a surprise for you, but he can't come in. He said to bring you out through the back so the other children don't see and feel left out. Can you come with me quickly? We don't want to spoil it." Dora looked up from her notebook. She looked at Mina carefully. There was a beat, a long, considering beat, in which Mina held very still and kept her expression entirely neutral and reminded herself that this was a 6-year-old. "My daddy usually comes through the front," Dora said. "He has a surprise," Mina said. "Something big. He didn't want anyone else to see it before you did." Another pause. Mina watched the calculation move behind those dark eyes. Her father, a surprise. The logic of an adult explaining something in a reasonable tone, and saw the moment it tipped. "Okay," Dora said, and she closed her notebook and tucked it into her backpack. "But I have to tell someone where I'm going, because that's the rule." "Your daddy already told them," Mina said smoothly, standing. "That's why they sent me. Come on, quickly. We don't want him to wait." The far bathroom in the east corridor was empty at this time of day, as it always was. The window latch had been unfastened the day before. Mina had come back in the evening when the building was quiet and loosened it. It swung open without resistance. The drop to the alley below was less than a meter. Dora went through first because Mina told her Woo Jin was waiting just around the corner, and she wanted to be first to see the surprise, and because at 6 years old, the gap between trusting a stranger and not trusting a stranger is very often just a story that sounds right. The moment her feet touched the ground in the alley, she understood that something was wrong. Her father was not there. She turned, and Mina was already through the window behind her, landing lightly, and the alley was empty and quiet, and nothing like the bright painted front entrance where her father always came, always with his steady hand and his warm for her smile. "Where's my daddy?" Dora said. Her voice was still level. She was, even now, her father's daughter. "He'll be along," Mina said. Her own voice had changed. The reasonable boredom was gone, and something harder had replaced it. She put her hand on Dora's shoulder and steered her toward the end of the alley. "Come on." Dora went. She went because she was 6, and Mina's hand was firm, and the alley had only one exit, and she was already thinking very hard about what she needed to do next, running through what she knew the way her father had taught her, to run through a chessboard, looking for the pieces, looking for the moves. She thought about Woo Jin. "He'll come," she told herself. "He always comes." She held on to that thought with everything she had, and she didn't make a sound. 1 hour later, Woo Jin received the call at 3:15 when he arrived at the preschool for the daily pickup and was met by a teacher whose hands were trembling as she explained that Dora had last been seen heading to the bathroom an hour ago and they had searched every room in the building, and she was not. He stopped hearing her at not. Yet the next hour was controlled chaos that only looked controlled because Woo Jin refused to allow it to be anything else. His bodyguards swept the building. The police were called. Security footage was reviewed. He stood in the corridor of that preschool with his hands clasped behind his back and his face a perfect enforced mask, and internally felt something tearing open in him that he had no word for and no armor against. He had known there were enemies who might try to reach him through the engagement announcement. He had put measures in place. He had assigned additional security. He had been, he believed, thorough. He had not been thorough enough. The thought arrived like a blade. Stella came to him within 20 minutes of his call, and her face when she walked through the door, the way all the color left it, the way her whole body seemed to go cold, was the worst thing he had seen in a very long time. He crossed the room to her, and she let him hold her, and he could feel her trying not to fall apart by sheer force of will. "We'll find her," he said into her hair. "You don't know that," she said. "I know it." She pulled back to look at him, and her eyes were red and enormous. "How can you know it?" "Because I will not stop until I do," he said. "Look at me, Stella. Look at me." He waited until she did. "I will not stop." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face the way a person searches for solid ground. She found it. They went back to the estate. The police set up in the main sitting room with their equipment. Woo Jin stood at the window, utterly still, and waited, because waiting was all he could do. And he had to do it without letting himself feel what was underneath it, because what was underneath it was a fear so profound and so total that it would have brought him to his knees if he had looked at it directly. His daughter, his 6-year-old, fearless, flower-drawing, chess-questioning, warrior-souled daughter, who had walked into his dining room and changed his entire life with 9 words, who put her small hand in his with such unguarded trust that it had broken open something in him he hadn't known was sealed, who told him gravely that his name was a good name and that she didn't mind sharing her mother with him. The text came through at 7:47. He opened it. He looked at the photo of Dora, small and frightened and tear-streaked, sitting on a floor in a room he didn't recognize, on her dress with the grass stain on the hem crumpled around her knees, and felt the fear become fury, white and clean and absolute. Then he read the second message. "I have your little angel. Do as I say, or you'll never see her again." Another message popped up almost immediately. "Don't bother using these messages to track my location. I scheduled them to send by this time before I abandoned the phone at a construction site 2 hours ago." Anger surged through Woo Jin as a vein throbbed in his temple. He had no idea who it could be. But just when he was about to still try and track the messages, a phone call came in. A random number. He alerted the police in the living room, and they prepared to track the call. The moment he picked it up, he already knew who it was. The feminine voice that mockingly laughed at him from the other end of the line was undeniably Mina's. "Mina," he gritted out. Stella sat up straighter, tears still striking down her cheeks. The police signaled to him to keep the call going for as long as possible, but he didn't need to do all that, because he already knew where they would be. Mina hadn't been the only one monitoring him. Woo Jin had also made sure to keep tabs on her and knew exactly when she had moved into her dilapidated apartment building and how much she was struggling to survive. He had stopped keeping tabs on her about a month ago, though, when it seemed she had completely erased herself from their world and was simply struggling to survive. He should have known better. Mina taunted Woo Jin for letting his guard down and making it easy for her to take Dora. Then she went straight to the point, not even letting him speak. She told him to liquidate 10 billion won worth of his shares and send it to the account number she had sent alongside the picture in the scheduled message earlier. She told him he had before morning to do it and hung up immediately. The police chief groaned in frustration when she ended the call after 50 seconds, not giving them enough time to track her location. But Woo Jin smiled because he knew exactly what was going to happen next. "I know where she is," he said. Stella was beside him before he had finished the sentence, her hand gripping his arm. "You know? How?" He took her face in his hands, his careful, precise, controlled hands that had spent their whole life learning not to reach for things, and looked at her. "Trust me," he said. Like something moved in Stella's eyes. Not blind trust, she was too intelligent for that, but something chosen, something deliberate and real. "Bring her home," she whispered. "I will," he said. "I promise." He kissed her forehead, and the tenderness of it, from this man at this moment, made Stella press her eyes shut briefly. Then he was out the door. Woo Jin and the police officers arrived at Mina's apartment building in less than 20 minutes. The building was precisely as dilapidated as it appeared in his records. The police moved into position around it with a quietness that was efficient and practiced. Woo Jin stood in the shadow of a doorway across the street and breathed in the cold night air. He had walked into boardrooms where his competitors were waiting to dismantle him. He had navigated threats and crises and betrayals that would have broken other men. He had always been the calmest person in whatever room he entered. He had never wanted anything the way he wanted his daughter back. The confirmation came through his earpiece. One adult female, one small child, confirmed inside. Woo Jin exhaled through his nose. He rolled his sleeves down. He nodded to the officer beside him. The entry was fast and quiet and overwhelming. He was behind the officers as they moved through the door, and then he was past them, because across the cramped and barely lit space, in a corner behind an overturned table, was Dora. She was sitting very upright on the floor, with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees and her chin up and her jaw set, the posture of someone working extremely hard at being brave. The posture of someone who had decided, with full 6-year-old conviction, that she was going to hold herself together until she didn't have to anymore. When she saw him come through the door, her face crumpled all at once, the way a child's face crumples when they've been holding it together for just long enough to fall apart safely. He crossed the room in 3 steps and gathered her up. She was so small. She pressed her face into his neck and wrapped her arms around him with a strength that was out of all proportion to her size, and he held her against his chest and felt, for the first time in his life, what it truly meant to have something irreplaceable. "I tried to be strong, Daddy," she said into his shoulder, muffled and wet and exhausted. "I tried to be brave like you." "I know, sweetheart." His voice was not steady. He stopped trying to make it so. "I know you did, and I am so proud of you. I am so extraordinarily proud of you." "I knew you'd come," she said. She sniffled. "I told myself, he'll come. He always keeps his promises." Something in his chest came undone completely. "I will always come," he said, low and fierce and absolute. "Do you hear me? I will always come." He held her more tightly, and his eyes, which had not produced tears in longer than he could remember, filled with them now, in this cramped and ugly little apartment, holding his daughter on a cold Tuesday night. Behind him, Mina was screaming as they pinned her, screaming and thrashing and weeping in the desperate, cornered anguish of a person who has played their last card and watched it fail in real time. The sound of her was raw and unraveling. Woo Jin did not turn around. He did not look at her. He did not need to. She had spent every ounce of her intelligence and cruelty and remaining resources on taking the one thing that mattered most to him, and she had failed, and everything that remained of her life would be the consequence of that failure. "Congratulations," he said, as he walked toward the door with Dora in his arms, his voice flat and final and carrying easily over the noise of the room. "Now I will make sure you never see anything other than the 4 corners of your cell until the day you die." He walked out. Behind him, Mina kept screaming. It faded as he descended the stairs, and then it was gone, and all that was left was the night air and the weight of his daughter against his chest and the sound of police radios crackling in the street below. He called Stella before he reached the car. She picked up on the first ring. "I have her," he said. "She's safe. She's with me." The sound that came from Stella on the other end of the line was not a word. It was something before words, relief and love, and the collapse of hours of held-together composure, and it was the most honest sound he had ever heard. "Come home," she said, when she could speak again. "We're coming," he said. We're on our way home." 3 months later. The venue was full of light. 3 months had passed since that Tuesday night. Mina had been arrested on charges of child kidnapping, attempted murder by poisoning, and the charges only multiplied as investigators went through her apartment. And the documents that linked her to the embezzlement and money laundering charges that had put her father in prison only added to the prosecution's case against her. Woo Jin had stopped thinking about Mina and her father in general. There were better things to think about. Considerably better things. He stood at the altar in a dark suit that fit him perfectly, which all his suits did, and watched the doors at the far end of the aisle. Around him, the venue was full. Stella's family from Chicago, laughing and photographing everything. His business partners in careful rows. The entire staff of the estate, the gardener and the chef and the head bodyguard and all the rest of them, who had loved Dora before Woo Jin ever had the chance to, cleaned up and smiling in their seats. The doors opened. Dora came first. And she was wearing a white dress she had declared deeply impractical, and small white flowers were tucked into her 2 lopsided pigtails, and she was carrying a basket of petals with the absolute seriousness of someone who understood the gravity of a great responsibility. She scattered petals with enormous deliberateness, occasionally pausing to examine one, occasionally making brief, decisive eye contact with guests she recognized along the aisle, and giving them a small nod of acknowledgement, like a dignitary on a procession. Then she looked up and saw Woo Jin at the altar, and beamed at him with a brightness that could have powered the entire room. He felt the tears before he knew they were coming. He was not a man who cried. He had not been one for a very long time, and he had been proud of this in the manner of someone who mistakes numbness for strength. He understood now very clearly that he had been wrong about that. The last 9 months had made him wrong about it in the most complete and irreversible way. Then Stella appeared in the doorway. She was in white, and she was breathtaking. And she was looking straight at him with an expression that was so full of feeling it made the air in the room seem to change quality. She walked toward him the way she did everything, purposefully, warmly, with her chin lifted and her eyes open, and he watched her come and felt the tears breach and did nothing to stop them. She reached him. She looked at his face. She shook her head slightly, at the small, fond, exasperated shake of a woman who is helplessly in love with a man for the exact parts of him he spent 35 years trying to hide. "You're crying," she said, very quietly. "I'm not," he said. "Woo Jin." "I'm not," he said again, and she laughed, a real, warm, unguarded laugh, and took his hand. Dora materialized at his other side and tugged his sleeve. "I told you she was nice to look at," she whispered, loudly enough for the front 3 rows to hear. "Didn't I tell you?" A wave of laughter moved through the guests, soft and warm and real, and Kim Woo Jin, who had once presided over the largest table in Korea in terrifying silence, stood at an altar with his daughter pulling his sleeve and his bride holding his hand, and laughed quietly in a room full of people who loved them. And for the first time in a very long time, the world felt exactly the right size. Stella had not been able to know when she bought 2 one-way tickets to a country whose language she barely spoke, searching for a man whose last name she didn't own, with a suitcase and a 6-year-old and nothing but the memory of a face. She had not been able to know how it would end. She had not known that the man she was looking for owned the very estate where she would find work to survive. She had not known that her daughter, her fearless, extraordinary, heart-of-gold daughter, would be the one to find him first and save his life before Stella even knew he was in danger. She had not known that love, when it is real, has a way of crossing whatever distance you place in front of it, and that it finds its way through 6 years and an ocean and all the embarrassment and uncertainty and silence in between, and it arrives, eventually, exactly where it was always going. She knew now. As the officiant's voice rose in the light-filled room and Dora pressed in between them with one small hand in each of theirs, Stella felt the whole shape of her life settle into place around her. Not like the completion of something that had been broken, but like the arrival of something that had always been coming. This was the beginning of the rest of their lives together. This was the beginning of their one big, beautiful, extraordinary family. This was the beginning of their happy ever after. The end. And that is how a love that was never supposed to happen became impossible to break. Yeah, from one reckless night in Chicago to 6 years of silence, to a fearless little girl who changed everything with a single sentence. This wasn't just a love story. It was fate, timing, sacrifice, and the kind of connection that refuses to be forgotten. But now I want to hear from you. If you were Stella, would you have taken that risk, crossing the world for a man you barely knew? If you were Woojin, could you forgive 6 years of silence and still choose love? And tell me, did Dora steal your heart the way she stole his? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives on these stories. And if this story made you feel anything, if it made your heart race, ache, or smile, go ahead and tap that like button. It really helps more people discover stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe to Afro-Korean romance cinema for more intense, emotional, and unforgettable love stories that cross borders, break rules, and stay with you long after the ending. And most importantly, turn on your notifications so you never miss the next story. Because trust me, the next one, it's just as powerful, just as addictive, and you won't want to come in halfway. Until the next story, stay curious, stay emotional, and never stop believing in love that finds its way back.